meeting is now being recorded.
On this webinar regarding the humanitarian crisis of the unaccompanied immigrant children. Just a couple of housekeeping items that I wanted to start off with today. First off, this webinar will be recorded, and we will be posting this on both the Council's website and sharing it with our other colleague organizations so that they can share it with their networks as well. So for any of your other peers or other organizations that were not able to join us this afternoon, that will be available for other people to access in the future. I think secondly then is everybody's lines except for the speakers will be muted over the course of the webinar just to block out any background noise and to ensure that we can hear the speakers well. If you do have any comments or problems or questions over the course of the webinar, in the top menu bar of your webinar screen, you'll see a little button for Q&A. All you need to do is press that, type in your comment, any issue that you're having, and we'll be able to monitor those. And then we are going to hold questions until the end of the presentations, but have held about 15 to 20 minutes for those, at which point we'll be going through and reading off questions that we see through that chat box and directing them towards the speakers. So I think then with that, what I'd love to just do is we'll flip over to the next slide about the meeting agenda. And I just want to, extend a special thank you to our speakers today. Darity Pesad, who is the president of GCIR, who will be kicking this off for us in just a second. And then she's joined by one of their GCIR's consultants who is an expert in this particular area, Aria Summers. And then from there, we're really excited to have the perspectives of a few different funders in different parts of the country who have been working closely with this issue from a number of different vantage points. And Bruce Esterline with the Meadows Foundation, Tony Benegas with the Arizona Community Foundation, and then Beatrice Solis with the California Endowment will all provide some perspectives based upon the work that they and their organizations have been doing. And then to really kind of provide a capstone, Tara Magner, who is with the MacArthur Foundation, will provide some additional kind of more overarching comments and suggestions around how funders can really get involved to help with this humanitarian crisis, and definitely build upon some of the work that the MacArthur Foundation has been doing both recently but in a few years past as well. So with that, I think what I will do, Darity, is really, the next slide quickly is just what our meeting goals and objectives are. And I think, we definitely feel really, really happy that, with this speaker lineup, we're going to be able to provide this information and more. But I don't want to take up any more time. So, Darity, without any further ado, please, kick us off.
Great. Thank you so much, Will. And thank you so much to the Council on Foundations for bringing this issue of unaccompanied immigrant children to the attention of its membership. And thanks to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in this webinar. The issue, I just wanted to give some context for today's webinar, and I won't speak for that long, but the issue of unaccompanied children is actually not new. Children have long traveled alone to foreign lands, for the U.S. going back to the days of Ellis Island. And historically, these children have come to reunite with their family, flee poverty, and seek refuge from violence and persecution. Excuse me. But what's different about the children who are fleeing Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala today and in recent years is that they are fleeing rampant gang violence. In a recent set of interviews of 322 child migrants from El Salvador, 60% cited violence as the main reason they were seeking refuge in the United States. We are looking at 3 countries in Central America that rank among the top 5 most violent countries in the world, with the highest homicide rates. The homicide rates in El Salvador and Guatemala today are higher than they were during the declared civil wars in those countries decades ago. And in Honduras, the murder rate is eclipsed only by, the rates of killings in Syria. So, I think the drivers of this, of children fleeing these three countries is extremely stark. So for all intents and purposes, these children are actually, refugees seeking protection in the United States. However, they're not treated as such, and you'll hear more about that from Aria as well as others. I have a little slide here, thanks to Tara Magner from the MacArthur Foundation, on that shows the trend in terms of, children who are apprehended. I talked about the gang violence. That's really the driving force. Poverty, domestic violence, and the desire to reunite with a parent, usually a mom, are also factors. But if you look at this chart and the dramatic leap in the number of children fleeing Central America, you'll see that, those factors are really secondary to the violence in most cases. So between 2009 and 2014, basically there's been a 21-fold increase in the number of children apprehended from these three Central American countries. And what's important to note that for a decade or more prior to 2010 and 2011, when the rise, began to happen, the number of accompanied immigrant children hovered between 6,000 and 8,000 per year, and that's from all countries, not just the three that are on the chart, all countries except for Mexico. And the U.S. has put in place a system of care, custody, and adjudication to meet the needs of the 6,000 to 8,000 figures I just cited, not the 80,000 to 120,000 that are expected to arrive, in the U.S. in 2014. So the infrastructure is not really there to assist these children. That's why you've seen, military bases being converted into detention centers and so forth. So the journey that the children take is extremely perilous, and they have to cross the entire length of Mexico on top of these freight trains, and many do get injured, physically from just the peril of being on the trains and falling off and so forth. But, throughout their journey east north, they have to endure extortion, beatings, and rapes in some cases. And if they're apprehended by the U.S. Border Patrol, which tens of thousands of children have been, they're taken into federal custody and detained in pretty much jail-like settings that I think you all have seen in news accounts. And once they're released, there's not that many resources available to support them in the community. So, one of the starkest examples is, thousands of children, some, extremely young, as 4 as 5, and they're appearing in immigration court alone without any legal representation. But what's been heartening for me is that the response from philanthropy has been pretty swift and very robust, just given the urgency of this issue. So on this call, you'll hear more about the complex set of issues facing unaccompanied minors that Aria is going to talk about, but you'll also hear about the exciting philanthropic initiatives that are underway with various foundations taking leadership in their local communities as well as nationally. And GCIR, obviously works on immigration and refugee issues, and if you have any questions after the call, please don't hesitate to contact me or any of my colleagues here at GCIR. We have a dedicated resource page on this topic on our website, and we're also working closely with a couple of dozen foundations to mount a locally driven but a nationally coordinated philanthropic response. So if any questions come up after the call, please don't hesitate to look to us as a resource. And at this point, I'll turn it back over to Will, who'll go to the next speaker.
Darity, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And I just would like to reiterate for everybody that GCIR's website is a fantastic, excellent resource for anyone either on this call or others you're working with on this issue of unaccompanied immigrant children. They continue to keep that updated, not only with resources from their particular expertise, but with the collaboration of funders that they're working with. And, a lot of the calls and questions that we here at the Council receive from members, we actually like to redirect a lot of people to their website and their staff, just because they really are a central point for disseminating information on this particular issue. I think with that, then, I'd love to just turn the virtual podium over to Aria Sumbers, who's an independent consultant and researcher on children's rights and migration policy, and has been working on this issue and with a lot of the communities affected by this issue for a number of years. And she's got some really terrific information to share, and is just a resource for all of us. So with that, Aria, welcome, and we look forward to hearing.
Thanks very much, Will, for this opportunity to speak about this critical issue. So I'd like to just jump into the presentation on our next slide. This portion of the presentation will focus on unaccompanied children and their needs. And I think it's really critical, a lot of us have seen in the media the coverage of unaccompanied children. And here you'll see the Children on the Run report, which was a UNHCR report that's publicly available, was released in March of this year to address this emerging crisis that many advocates had indicated, as well as the government had noted, an increasing trend. And really what developed during this period of time and right after the report is that a humanitarian crisis unfolded for children from Central America and Mexico as they have fled across the region in search of protection. So this is not just an issue in the United States, but it is a challenge across the region where children are seeking protection. And the numbers are quite stark. In the region itself, over 700% increase in asylum seekers in other parts of the region. And here I also highlight the point of view of children. I think it's really critical to keep in mind whenever we talk about this subject that really we need to put ourselves in the perspective of the child and think about this whole process that I'm going to describe to you through the eyes of a child. So I might repeat that a couple of times, but I think it's quite important to remember that these are children. And as Darren pointed out, the numbers have increased dramatically, and in 2013 we saw our first major increase in almost doubling to nearly 25,000, so 24,668. And in 2014, we have seen an increase or expected increase of 60,000 with 43,000 that have already arrived. And so I think this is something, it's unprecedented, and our systems have been strained by this incredible surge of children seeking protection. If you could please move to the next slide. This visual is taken straight from the UNHCR report, Children on the Run. And in the report, we conducted interviews with 404 children who were already in the United States and were seeking protection. And we asked them a number of different questions in a narrative format. And so they responded in a narrative form about all of the reasons that they had decided to flee or leave their countries. And so as you can see here, we had quite a bit of complexity in the children's responses about why they were leaving their country. But we do see the very strong piece on violence in society. As Darren pointed out, the levels of gang and cartel violence in Central America and Mexico is extremely high, as well as abuse in the home. So in these countries, the child protection systems that respond to domestic violence in some cases are non-existent or just barely functioning. So children have very few protections to look to in their own communities if they want to seek protection, which is very different from our experience here in the U.S., where we do have child protection systems to try to respond to abuse in the home. Another important point about this particular visual is that you will see that children have overlapping and layered reasons for coming. And this is important to take note of. Children do and may have family in the United States, but they are also seeking protection. So those things work together. A child is going to go somewhere where they may have someone that could receive them, particularly if they are fleeing for their lives. And so I think this demonstrates to us how children were able to articulate these many different reasons that they needed to come. And definitely throughout the report, what came across very clearly was fear. Children had a fear of being in their countries of origin. And we found that nearly 60% of the children could potentially be eligible for asylum and other forms of humanitarian protection. So in the next slide, I'm going to move into our U.S. system. This slide is sort of paints a very quick bullet list of our federal agencies. So this is something really critical to understand about this system. The entire system is a federal system that I'm going to be describing. None of this system is a state-based system. If I refer to foster care, I'm going to be referring to a federal foster care system. And so this is really important to keep in mind because this has been the source of some confusion in some of the media. And the way our federal agencies are structured to work with unaccompanied children, this structure has largely been in place since 2002. And that happened because of the Homeland Security Act of 2002, which changed the law and changed the structure of our system and also created the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So what we have here is a layout of our federal agencies. First, we have the U.S. Department of Justice, and they operate the Executive Office for Immigration Review. And what those essentially are the administrative immigration courts. So when we refer to immigration judges or children in deportation proceedings, this is the proceeding that they're appearing before. It's before the U.S. Department of Justice. Next, we have the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. As I mentioned, it was formed in 2002. And there are three main components that an unaccompanied child may have contact with. The first two, Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection, are enforcement arms of Homeland Security, and so a child may be apprehended. So when we speak about apprehension, it is primarily one of these two agencies of Homeland Security that enforce and apprehend under U.S. immigration law. The third agency, USCIS, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, they are the grant-making aspect of Homeland Security. So if anyone applies for a visa to come to the United States, or if they're applying for adjustment of status or any variety of benefits under U.S. immigration law, these are adjudicated by USCIS. So next, moving on, we have the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Refugee Resettlement. This was the significant change that occurred in 2002, and what happened at that time, if we could step back just a moment to the prior slide, is that the Office of Refugee Resettlement was tasked with the care and custody of unaccompanied children. Before 2002, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, as it used to be called, the INS, had the care and custody of unaccompanied children, but that shifted in 2002 to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which had historical experience in working with unaccompanied refugee minors. Next, we have the U.S. Department of State. They coordinate aid abroad. So USAID and other programs have been, this year particularly, beginning to develop programs that are targeted to children and youth in the region. And we are still waiting for more involvement of state to support development initiatives for children and protection initiatives. And then finally, on June 2nd of this year, FEMA was authorized by a presidential memorandum to coordinate a response to the humanitarian crisis at the border. And the U.S. Department of Defense was also authorized to use military bases to house unaccompanied children. And these military bases are now being phased out. So there was a dramatic increase in the use of the military bases, and now we're seeing a decrease in that. If we could move to the next slide. And so in this slide, the intent behind the slide is to sort of give you a sense of the flow through of how a child would flow through our federal system. And at each point, a different federal agency is involved. So this is really from child's perspective, what an unaccompanied child would encounter as they enter our system. And at the beginning, we see the apprehension at the border and the transfer by federal government authorities to a temporary shelter. So that apprehension occurs at the border, sometimes on the interior, but almost, in this particular context, it's been almost entirely along the border. And the next step that happens for a child is they're transferred out of the custody of ICE or Customs and Border Protection, and they're transferred to the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So that's our second box, which are the federally funded temporary shelters across the United States. So a child may be apprehended on the Texas border and could be placed in a shelter along the Texas border, or they could be sent to a shelter in a different part of the country. And the children are temporarily held there during a family reunification process as well as an immigration court process. And so at this point, we consider that the children are in federal custody. They're in a federally funded custodial shelter operated by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And from that point, the child has a variety of possibilities. The first one is they can be placed in a federal long-term care program. These are foster care programs in the United States that are operated through contracts with the Office of Refugee Resettlement by two primary agencies, LIRS and USCCB, and we can provide more information for those of you who are interested in those particular programs. Those are operating at the federal level. And those are generally for children who have a strong form of humanitarian relief but do not have any family or caregivers in the United States that are willing to receive them. The next possibility is a child could be released to a caregiver in the United States. And this is what we call our community placement. And the majority of children, somewhere between 80 to 90%, are released to caregivers in the United States. And I wanted to highlight the Office of Refugee Resettlement just recently released on their website county-level data for unaccompanied children released to sponsors or caregivers. And they have each state and the highest release counties listed on their website, which is an excellent resource for those who are interested in understanding where children are arriving in their particular state or community. And finally, a child can be deported to their country of origin. And this can happen directly from the shelter if no form of relief is detected for them and they cannot be released to a caregiver for any number of reasons. Then they may be returned or deported to their country of origin. There is a section of our law that calls for safe repatriation of children and reintegration to their countries of origin, but this has not been fully implemented, and so we do not have very good programs. Once a child is returned, we do not have a lot of information about what happens to them. And some of the governments in the region, in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, have attempted to respond to this, but have very limited resources to receive children who are deported. And importantly, I have this in bold underneath our flow chart, is that while children are going through this process, they are also appearing in federal immigration court hearings. And as you recall, this is before the Executive Office of Immigration Review with an immigration judge. But children are not appointed attorneys or guardians ad litem. They will appear on their own if they do not have a pro bono attorney or they cannot afford an attorney. In addition, children are going through a process that was really designed for adults. So all of the standards are set for adults. There's nothing really specific for children. And courts have worked with advocates to try to create a better atmosphere for children and to relax some of the more stringent procedures so that children have a little bit more time to speak about their cases. And I'm going to just give you a caveat in a minute about that particular issue. But it is important to note that these are adult standards and adult courts as opposed to children's courts that we see in our country that were set up for in our child welfare system. Next, I think it's important to recognize is that various estimates from the United Nations and also from advocates on the ground find that anywhere between 60 to 70% of children are eligible for humanitarian relief. However, they do not have the resources themselves to present their cases on their own. So without attorneys, those children cannot access those forms of relief because to articulate and present an asylum claim is very resource intensive and requires really an attorney to do so. And so with this kind of estimate, but with no attorney, it creates a significant challenge in our system. And there have been some positive policy developments in the court-level system. So first of all, we've seen the development of child-only dockets within the immigration court system. And the hope is that this will help create more expertise among certain immigration judges who will learn how to work better with children appearing in their courts, and will also make it easier for children to get access to pro bono attorneys, because pro bono attorneys can then appear on that same day and they'll know that that's the child-only docket. That's when only the children will appear in court. So that's an important development. And second, the Department of Justice announced a program this year through AmeriCorps, which is intended to provide access to counsel. It's a $2 million program, and it's a nationwide program in some key cities that have high numbers of unaccompanied children who do not have representation. And so this will be discussed later, but there are opportunities to complement that program because the program was designed with a very low salary, and sometimes it's difficult to attract the talent that we need for the attorneys who represent children in the proceedings. So one caveat that I mentioned that I wanted to raise that just recently has happened in August is the emergence of something that we're all calling the rocket dockets. And this is happening in different cities across the country, that children are being placed quickly on immigration court dockets, and we're not getting enough time for children to get access to attorneys. And so this is causing significant challenges for us across the system, and it's something that advocates are working with the Executive Office of Immigration Review to try to shift again so that children will have enough time to present their cases. Next, on our next slide, this is sort of pulling everything together, which is really thinking about the overall needs for unaccompanied children in the current crisis. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that we've highlighted 3 steps in the process: what happens to children at the border, what happens to children in federal custody, and finally in the community. So at the border and in federal custody, what we've learned is the vast majority of federal funding is spent while children are in some form of custody. And when children are released to caregivers in communities, there are minimal resources for legal and social services. And there are a few agencies that have been subcontracted to provide some social services for certain numbers of children. It's a very small percentage who actually get the support. And the 3 large national agencies that do that are LIRS, USCCB, and USCRI. On the other side, you'll see that we've analyzed 3 levels of needs. So these are sort of our intersecting levels of analysis. The 3 levels of needs that we've identified are basic humanitarian needs, legal services, and finally community-based services related to education, trauma-informed care, health and well-being, and case management services. If we could move to our next slide. And this visual gives you a sense of the top 10 states for community placement. So these are the places where children are being released to a caregiver or a sponsor. About 50%, some estimates are slightly higher, about 50% of the children who are released are being released to a parent or a similar adult relative, an aunt or an uncle. So I think this is important to keep in mind that the children are coming into families. And this is not simply a release into the community without a family member to support them. So I think this is really important to keep in mind. And you'll see that we've highlighted the top 10 states and some of the key cities that have the highest numbers of unaccompanied children arriving to the communities. And I just wanted to make a notation for Georgia and North Carolina. You'll see that there's an asterisk for those two states. The reason for that is in Georgia, for instance, the Atlanta Immigration Court will see children who are in Tennessee, Alabama, and southern South Carolina. So the actual number of children who will appear in Georgia for immigration court is much higher than just the number who will release to Georgia. And so the attorneys who are working at the Atlanta Immigration Court will have to somehow respond to all the children who are coming from these different states for immigration court. In North Carolina, it's similar. They also receive children from the northern part of South Carolina, so their number is also slightly higher. And so overall, what we've seen is that the focus of a lot of the funders has been on the release or community placement area because so few resources have been placed into that area, and a lot of the legal services advocates are just completely overwhelmed, as well as some social services. And so I think it's really critical to think about the overall needs together with the sort of the community placement component when thinking about potential ways to respond to the unaccompanied children crisis. And thank you very much. I look forward to any questions.
Aria, thank you so very much for that presentation. And I think, just first, the wealth of information that you're able to provide is tremendously helpful, but I think it also gives all of us a much better appreciation for the complexity of the situation, and within that complexity, though, just where, funders and other community leaders can focus attention, based upon what their particular priorities may be and where they can choose to focus resources. I know we've had a number of people join over the course of the last 15 to 20 minutes, so a couple of reminders on housekeeping. One, this entire webinar is being recorded and will be available both on the Council website, and we'll be sharing it with our other colleague organizations joining us today here, so for anybody to access that, along with the slides throughout the webinar as well. So definitely encourage anyone to feel free to, access that, review it, and, potentially share it with other members of the staff or board members of your organizations as well. And then just second, through the course of the webinar, the lines have been muted, but feel free to ask questions because we are monitoring those. And then our main question and answer period towards the end of the webinar is where we'll be able to directly address some of those before we wrap up. So I think with that, though, I'd like to move to the next segment of the webinar. And this is where we wanted to share the perspectives from some different funders throughout the country and how they have been addressing and dealing with the unaccompanied immigrant children issue in their communities or even beyond their communities, in collaboration with other funders. And so we will begin with Bruce Esterline, who's the Vice President for Grants at the Meadows Foundation based in Dallas, Texas. And Bruce, I'll turn it over to you to share a little bit more about what you and your colleagues have been doing.
Great. Thanks, Will. And great job, Era, on that explanation on all points that you elaborated. A very excellent overview, very precise, and as far as I can tell, is exactly the information that we've been getting from all the folks involved. Again, Meadows Foundation, we're based in Dallas. We're a statewide funder, and therefore, when this issue began to become manifest on our border, we share a very long border with Mexico, and learned that this was sort of the epicenter of where most of these children were arriving. We started to get involved and interested. I just would make a side note. It was interesting to me that this has been, as Era pointed out and the previous speaker, we've been getting a lot of these children, over the course of the last number of 10 years, decades, in particular. And although the spike, probably occurred looking backwards, started maybe in October, November, it really wasn't until the media picked it up nationally and locally did I think any of us speaking for ourselves anyway, really get to appreciate the problem, and so clearly couldn't have sort of gotten ahead of it. But it's just, I think, an interesting commentary on how we are sort of limited by what we learn from media. In this case, it was a good, important story. What our first response was we began to try to obtain as much information. We have excellent relationships and contacts with disaster-type organizations throughout the state and folks in the Rio Grande Valley. So as we began to collect information for our own purposes to try to decide what role, if any, we could provide, we decided to host a funders briefing for, we opened it up to really kind of, it was sort of invitational, but basically we invited as many foundations that we thought might be interested. And we had a great turnout. This is about 3 weeks ago. Had over 20, maybe 30 foundations, some online, here in Dallas, and we had really an all-day session on the issue. And what we tried to do with our meeting was pretty much what Era did with her flow chart, was have representatives from each of those boxes here and talking about the situation firsthand. We had folks from the regional, the federal regional HHS and FEMA office. We had 2 community-based groups that were working with children and families on the border in McAllen. We had the largest ORR, Office of Refugee and Resettlement Services operator. I think Era said, but I would point out that ORR contracts, as far as I can tell, contracts with nonprofit providers across the country, has always done this, to manage these transitional shelters for the unaccompanied kids. They do not operate them as federal agencies or federal programs, yes, but they don't actually operate the shelters, so they're contracted out. And we've actually done business with a lot of these folks, sometimes in the UAC population, and a lot of them operate other services for children and families, not necessarily these children. Also, we had 2 organizations that provide either find, recruit, and train pro bono lawyers and or provide staff attorneys to these children. And we had the County Health and Human Services Director. So we got a great overview. It parallels exactly what Era went through. What I think we learned from that is that the federal aspects, the federal components of this system, going from the federal responsibilities to ORRs to resettlement in the communities, the feds are not set up for nor particularly desirous of outside assistance. And I think it's a combination of things, but primarily being the sort of the perceived security issues, because these kids, as described, are considered in the federal custody of the federal government. And so there's little or no opportunity for community-based groups supported and or supported by philanthropy to engage with these children really until they get into the communities. There are some exceptions to that, and I'll talk about it. What we offered to do at the end of this funders briefing was to sort of serve to sort of coordinate proposals and applications for assistance from a variety of the potential applicants on behalf of them, and to sort of be the intermediary with other funders using a common application form, et cetera. And that's a role we continue to provide. We've got about $1.5 million worth of proposals that have been sent to us, and that we're shopping around with our colleagues. And we at the Meadows Foundation will be trying to do something with different parts of the needs that have been given to us. They fall into sort of, I'd say, 3 buckets. The first one is, and I want to add, there's another population here that has not been mentioned, but I think we all should be aware of it, and that's accompanied children. Okay, we've been talking about unaccompanied children in the neighborhood of 60,000. We have an equal amount of accompanied children that have been brought into the country with a parent or a family member or some person, adult. And there's a different process that is used to handle them. It's a much more expedited process, but there are probably more opportunities for philanthropy with that group than there are with the unaccompanied children for the reasons that have already been mentioned. A word or two about that. These are the ones that, how I would classify them, these are women coming in, primarily women, not with men, coming in with 2, 3, 4 children. They may be their biological children and or a cousin, a nephew, what have you. They present just like the children do. They're apprehended just like the unaccompanied children are, but they are not. They are put into the holding cells at the Border Patrol, but almost very soon moved on to go to a destination city. So they are not kept in custody very long. They do not go on to an ORR facility. But there's time on the ground between the time they are released from the Border Patrol facility until they get to the destination city. And so a lot of the things you've seen on TV, at least we have here in Texas, is a transit centers in McAllen, Brownsville, and Laredo, primarily McAllen, where these women and children are being given humanitarian assistance. They may reside there for 1, 2, 3 days, but it's not a long-term deal. They've been given a bus ticket and an order to appear before an immigration court, down the road. So these are transit centers, but this is totally, essentially, philanthropically supported, and some of the same organizations that are working with these women with children are trying to gain access to the unaccompanied children. There appears to be some degree of latitude that the individual Border Patrol commanding officer can allow in terms of letting nonprofit groups come into the facility or bring items to be given to the children in the facility. So the two groups we're working with is Catholic Charities, the Rio Grande Valley, and Save the Children, the international relief group. And the other thing one of the things that Save the Children is doing, which is something I think kind of gets lost in the shuffle too, is they're providing sort of psycho-emotional support to the transit shelter staff and offering it to some of the law enforcement. And we've got different kinds of law enforcement on the ground. We've got the federal Border Patrol agents. Our governor has sent down National Guard troops to sort of pick up the slack that's where these folks are being diverted to watch the children. And then you've got local personnel who are involved one way or another with sort of this whole morass. And so we feel mental health is a very important item for us here at Meadows, and so we're pleased to see that groups like Save the Children are also thinking about some of the people that are who are overwhelmed by all of this and who are being asked to take on roles they never expected to take on. The other requests we have are from the 2 or 3 organizations that we know in the Dallas area that do the pro bono lawyer business, and we are looking at proposals to add additional staff attorneys, both to provide direct representation as well as to be part of the recruitment of the pro bono folks. We are also talking to the largest ORR facility operator in the country, who's based here in Austin, about needs that his organization has that are outside what the federal government is paying for, or he's having to divert resources from some of his other programs that are non-UA, non-unaccompanied children to take care of them, and we're maybe looking at helping him backfill some of those needs. Lastly, we're looking at that whole resettlement piece. Era laid it out. These are kids who ultimately, both the women and children as well as the unaccompanied children, end up somewhere, and as you can see, over 4,000 of them end up in Texas. Into local communities, and there does not, at this point in our understanding, there does not seem to be any one single agency, federal, state, or otherwise, that has any responsibility once the handoff to the sponsor family is made. What we're talking to is people who will take on that responsibility and do sort of a case management of these families to ensure that these kids, and in some cases the moms, who are new arrivees, get the services they need, particularly, again, around mental health, because so many of them, for reasons that have been already discussed, have been pretty well traumatized either at home, on the way, or since they got here. So we're very keen on making sure, at a minimum, that mental health piece gets addressed on a longer-term basis. And the other thing I think was, sort of in summing up, a mystery piece for us is the federal foster care system. We haven't been able to talk to anybody yet that can kind of give us an understanding of that, because we work with state foster care system in a variety of ways, and we would like to see if there's anything philanthropy can do for those families who are fostering these kids and that whole system. And at this point, I have no information to add to that. Finally, I would say that we're going to be also looking at some of the organizations I mentioned, Save the Children again being one of them, that is willing to take on more of a policy advocacy role and talk about the needs of these children now and in the future. So that's sort of the menu of work that we've been involved in. As I said before, we sort of have offered to be kind of a coordinator of information, of proposals, and help so that maybe these organizations don't have to go knocking on 20 different doors. They can really just put a proposal in, and we can circulate it and get some responses. So as of right now, I can only say that one organization has come through with a pledge to help on the legal representation side. The rest of us are still figuring out how best to help. We are considering taking probably $500,000 worth of proposals to our board at the second week of September. That's my story.
Well, Bruce, thank you very much. That's some terrific work, and I think especially just sort of how you and the Meadows Foundation is serving as a central coordination point for a lot of the work going in and on and around across the state of Texas. It's great. We are seeing some questions come across the webinar platform, and we are recording those, so we'll definitely be kind of following up on those towards the end of the presentation in the Q&A section. But now I'd like to turn to Tony Venegas, who is going to offer sort of a dual perspective, both from his role as the Honorary Consul of Honduras in Phoenix, and then also as a philanthropic advisor at the Arizona Community Foundation. So, Tony, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So, like Will said, I'll talk about both my roles as a Consul of Honduras and also as a philanthropic advisor with the Arizona Community Foundation. Up until last June, we had a Consul General in Phoenix that covered the state of Colorado, Utah, Nebraska, and Arizona. Unfortunately, the office was closed, so since July of last year, I've been the primary contact for Hondurans residing in those states. So I've been getting a lot of calls and assisting Honduras in any way I can. On May 29th, literally as I was driving to work, I heard on the local radio station, the local NPR, that the ICE was going to start dropping women and children at the local Greyhound station. I happened to be nearby the downtown, and I went after lunch, and yes, there was a bus loaded with women and children. I quickly identified 18 from Honduras, and I started assisting those families getting their tickets, contacting their family members all over the U.S. So they can get on their way. Immediately, we called my colleagues from Guatemala and El Salvador, and I got on the phone with ICE and asked that we please be informed if they were going to be doing this, because we needed to know and assist. The next 4 days, we started getting 2 to 3 buses daily at the Greyhound station, again, women and children. These women had been in detention in Texas for up to 2 weeks. Some had not taken a shower. Some babies had diapers that had not been changed in over a week. Through our informal network of volunteers, we were able to set up headquarters, the local unions, and we assisted the families with basic needs, food, shelter, diapers, even money for buses so they could join their family members. as a consul of Honduras, I was able to prepare IDs for the Hondurans so they could fly if the families could afford an airfare ticket to go wherever they needed to go. We moved over 500 families in 5 days. There were about 180 from Honduras, with women and mostly women and children. I personally interviewed about 80 from Honduras, just got basic information, where they're coming from, where they were going. This family were given 30 days to appear in court, and I'm monitoring that right now, where they are. On June 7th, the first flight arrived to Tucson from Texas with children, and they were taken to Nogales. This is about an hour drive from Tucson. And I drove to Nogales on June 7th, and I ended up spending the next 10 days, 10 to 12 hours a day at the facility, interviewing children one by one. At the height of this crisis, we had almost 1,300 children, babies, teenage mom with babies to 17-year-olds. Again, these children came from Texas. Many had not taken a shower in 2 weeks, and they changed their clothes in 2 weeks. So you can imagine what it looked like. Even today, it's hard for me to describe what the facility looked like, because it's a detention center with razor wire all over the place, Border Patrol agents all over the place, babies crying and screaming for their parents. So suffice it to say, they were not ready to do this. There were portable toilets. FEMA came in a few days later. One thing that was very frustrating, was mentioned earlier, was that they would not allow any outside help. I mentioned that in Phoenix we moved over 500 families and helped them with basic needs. The mayor of Nogales was ready to step in the second day with toothpaste and basic stuff to help, but they would not allow any outside help. It took them 5 days to finally build the showers and allow the children and to take a bath and to start changing their clothes. But needless to say, it was a very, very difficult times. I spent a lot of time interviewing children, and I was able to interview 448 children to get their names, the location where they're coming from, where they were going, and a good history of where they were coming from. The media, of course, was always dying to know why they were here, and like it was said earlier, there is no secret that we, unfortunately, Honduras have the highest crime in the world. San Pedro Sula still has the highest crime in the world. So yes, violence, of course, the gangs, the insecurity. But one thing I tell everyone I talk to, that based on my interviews of 448 children, 95% of these children had their mom, their dad, or both parents here in the U.S. So they were coming to be with their parents. And something that was also, I think, sad and tragic is that a lot of these children, 14-year-olds, the mom left when they were 6 months old, and so they don't really know their mom except from pictures or videos during the holiday season. So the children all left Nogales, of course. They were sent to the shelters all over the U.S., which was very traumatic because they were sent all over, literally. I had instances of children going to New York, and then they were coming back to Phoenix because that's where their parents were. They just show you how the disarray in the system at that time. But now the children have been sent to the family members. Again, a very small percentage did not have immediate family members, and I'm monitoring that. And to my knowledge, I think a few of those children have been deported, but the great majority are with families waiting for a court hearing. I am staying in touch with a lot of the families. They tell me that they've been asked to call a number to see when the court date is, but what I've heard is that it will take 2 to 3 years before they go before a judge. So right now I'm coordinating with my colleagues from Guatemala and El Salvador to identify children that ended up in Arizona. Phoenix, was being the largest city, will have the most of the children, Tucson and other small surrounding communities. Because we know these children will need help. Like Arya mentioned early on, many of these children will need health care, behavioral health. Again, what they endure in that trip can only describe as horror, and they will need behavioral health. I know for that for a fact, for interviewing children who had not only the psychological scars, but physical scars from running away from gangs or witnessing the parents being gunned down right in front of their eyes. So I know they will need behavioral health. They will need tutoring assistance. They will need ESL classes. They will need legal assistance. So I'm coordinating right now with my colleagues to get accurate counts. So far, we think we have about 80 of those children that are around here in Phoenix and Tucson area. And monitoring the court dates. Again, the children that came in May with their parents are going to court. One thing I just noticed, I found out, is that a lot of these families are being braces are being placed on this mom, and they're given a second court date. As funders, there's been a lot of interest from my colleagues on what we can do. I'm hope to have a convening later in September, early October, with my colleagues here from the other foundations to address these needs, and we have a history of doing this, pulling our resources to provide funding to local providers so they can do legal aid, they can do health care, and they can do behavioral health. Again, that will be happening later next month or early October. I'll turn it over to you, Will, and I'll answer any questions at the end.
Tony, thank you very much, and I think it was especially useful just your perspective as the consul and sort of working with your peers from Guatemala and Nicaragua as well, and kind of just having a much kind of more clear understanding of what's happening in those countries that I think is at the root cause in many respects of this broader humanitarian crisis.
Yeah,
I think. Oh, pardon?
El Salvador. You mentioned Nicaragua.
Oh, I apologize. Sorry. My apologies. With that, I would like to turn it over to Beatrice Solis, who is the Director of Healthy Communities at the California Endowment. And so, Beatrice, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, again, to Council of Foundations and GCIR for putting together this webinar. I think it's timely and important. So I'll jump into it because I know we definitely want to move on to the next presentation and get to Q&A. But here at the California Endowment, we're a health conversion foundation, and our funding focuses on California. And when this issue emerged, we started hearing it from folks on the ground, nonprofit organizations and civic leaders, that this was an issue that the endowment needed to pay attention to. And so as a result of that, we took a little bit of time to figure out, one, what was our internal bandwidth in terms of staffing to be able to respond to this humanitarian crisis, and then the other part of it was how can we respond in a faster way, and knowing sometimes that our structures and systems that we have in place within each of our foundations can either be a hiccup or can really help accelerate the work. But at the end of the day, we decided that we would have a multi-pronged strategy. And so the first part of the strategy is that we recognize, again, sort of confirming what everybody is saying, is that changing the narrative on this population is absolutely critical. And how do we begin to change that narrative to a more compassionate tone? We also recognize that we did not need to enter into the already contentious space around immigration reform and deep sentiments that have been coming up around this issue, but also immigration in general. So how do we bring a compassionate, caring approach? So as a result of that, we sort of put up a website, They Are Children, as a way to engage a wide variety of individuals to be able to express their sentiments and welcoming comments to these kids and families. At this point, we have about 3,000 people from across the country that have responded, and several of them are children. Another component of the changing the narrative space is working diligently with faith-based organizations and leaders in the community in terms of, again, reframing, this issue and why it's so urgent to address. Another prong of the approach was we know that our funds are limited here at the California Endowment, we have every year, at least since I've been here for the last 7 years, sort of a disaster relief line item, so to speak, in our budget. And we felt that as a health foundation and that really looks at the social determinants of health in terms of how we address issues, we felt it was really important to figure out, with those limited funds, how do we have the most impact. And as a result of that, we reached out to one of our partners, Univision, to just begin noodling and thinking about how can we lift the profile, how do we change the narrative, and is there a potential to create a, quote-unquote, something like a telethon-like campaign. And so as a result of conversations that happened between July 4th and now, we came up with some very concrete next steps. So there will be a campaign beginning on Univision National from September 1st through the 30th. And they will use their property, so to speak, their Despierta América, Sábado Gigante, their news programs, and other products like that, also radio, social media, to begin to get the word out about the campaign. And in addition to that, Sábado Gigante will be sort of the key linchpin, and Sábado Gigante is a program every Saturday that comes on, has about 10 million viewers for many years. So it's a program that many families watch on Saturdays. And much of the programming is going to lead to Sábado Gigante to wrap up the campaign. There will be stories, there will be information that will not just focus on California but other areas. And then the funds that are raised will then get targeted in what I would say is sort of similar bucket areas that have been outlined by GCIR. And I'll say that GCIR and HIP have been amazing partners. We would not have been able to get this far without them. GCIR, as evidenced by the presentations on this webinar today, they have the content expertise, have the bench strength, and we were humbly going to them to help us noodle through these issues. And at the end of the day, what we have is sort of the intellectual capital of GCIR to help think more deliberately about what are the immediate needs, what organizations need support, not only in California but across these very specific regional areas. And thirdly, how do we begin to deploy these funds quickly as possible? And Hispanics in Philanthropy, as a backbone organization, has the capacity to be able to quickly move funds out. So the endowment made a commitment to GCIR to support them in this work, as well as Hispanics in Philanthropy. So we, to date, have a few partners that have joined in. We put in $500K catalytic fund, and the James Irvine Foundation and Margaret Casey Foundation have jumped into this partnership as well. So we're hoping that other funders across the country that want to use this backbone infrastructure with GCIR and HIP are more than welcome to participate in that. And likewise, in terms of the They Are Children campaign, we feel like we don't have the answer to everything. We know it's a long-term problem. We know that it's not going to be easy to change the narrative, but we're unabashedly willing to share everything that we're learning. So if anybody has any more specific questions, I'm happy to answer them, but I will end it there. Thank you.
Beatrice, thank you so much for that. And I think, one of the great takeaways from your presentation is just the power of collaboration. And I think, the California Endowment working with both GCIR and HIP, Hispanics in Philanthropy, on some of the different initiatives that the California Endowment has been taking on to build awareness around this issue, because that's definitely another important aspect as different people throughout the country, I think, get information from an array of different resources. So with that, I'd like to then now turn to Tara Magner with the MacArthur Foundation, who has been involved with this issue at MacArthur and their organization for a number of years. And she's going to kind of give us a broader perspective, I think, about an overview of various ways that funders can help to respond to this crisis. So I will go ahead and just turn it over to you, Tara, and Tara, are you able to hear us?
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Yes. Okay.
Okay. Great. Thanks. So thank you to the Council on Foundations and to GCIR for organizing this briefing, which has been wonderfully comprehensive, and I hope people are not now terrified. But what I keep saying about this issue, and I don't mean to say it in a flip way, but it is so complicated and expansive that there is something for every type of donor that can be addressed, whether funders are focusing on immigration and refugee issues, children's issues, education issues, mental health, etc., whether funders are locally focused, regionally focused, or nationally focused. So jumping to this first slide, I'll give you a quick promo for a longer document that GCIR put together. These few slides you'll see now contain just the headlines from that, but the document contains a little bit of explanation of each bullet point to give you a sense of how funders can respond. And I think we'll have a link to that very good document at the end. And as mentioned earlier, GCIR has been updating these documents regularly, so they are very well designed to keep you abreast of what is evolving in a rapidly changing situation. So you've already heard about the very, very complicated legal system in which the children find themselves upon apprehension in the United States. There is no end to the need for legal services for the children, and it is for the initial screening, what we call Know Your Rights presentations, trying to explain to the children how the system will work once they are in deportation proceedings, and then actual representation for any child who may have a valid claim for status as a refugee or specialized visas that exist for crime victims, trafficking victims, and children who have been neglected or abandoned. So all across the country, legal services are desperately needed. They're needed at the border when the children first arrive, but they're also needed in all of the places where to which children are released when they're released to families. And so that the map you saw earlier is a good indication of where many of the children are landing once they are released from custody. So every place that the children are living will need legal assistance. And so you can see from this first slide the general notion of providing services, recruiting and training pro bono attorneys. We've had a great response through various organizations such as American Immigration Lawyers Association has been recruiting teams of lawyers to go down near the border. A lot of people have gone to Artesia, New Mexico, where I think it was Bruce was talking about the situation of mothers and children in the detention facility. Many, many lawyers have volunteered their time to fly down and spend a week helping that population get screening and services. There are a few pilots that have been set up by the federal government with some funding for appointed counsel. Those can be bolstered with support for augmenting the compensation of lawyers. The Justice AmeriCorps program, which is mentioned here, is part of Committee for National Service, Corporation for National Service, and there's a statutory cap of just under $20,000 for any person who is an AmeriCorps member, which is their terminology for employee. So lawyers who join this program will be paid only $20,000 a year, and there's a lot of fundraising trying to augment that with housing, transportation, student loan repayment, et cetera, as well as to help the NGOs who house those lawyers provide technical assistance and training. So there's, as I say, there's a never-ending need for all of the things you see on this slide relating to legal service. And if anyone has questions, we'd be more than happy to fill in the blanks for you. Why don't we jump to the next slide? There are other kinds of direct services that need to be provided, again, at the border and also in all of the locations where children are released to shelters and families. We need humanitarian monitoring of how children are treated while in custody. This term wraparound services typically refers to mental health counseling, trauma counseling, other types of services that children may need based on the reasons for which they fled initially and any experiences upon their journey, many of which are unspeakably difficult. Greater training for the staff of the shelters, and then a whole host of issues in the communities where the children reside with families. English as a second language, help for the schools that receive the influx of children, more mental health services and public health services in those communities, et cetera. And then in the region itself, where the countries of origin are located, there are organizations that run shelters for migrants to rest and get basic medical care and have a safe place to sleep and eat upon their journey. Those migrant shelters can always use assistance for those who can fund outside the United States. Better research into some of the drivers of migration, understanding what the triggers of migration are. We know that they are violence from organized crime, gang recruitment, violence in the home, domestic violence, in some cases extreme deprivation of livelihood, the inability of families to have enough food on the table for anyone to survive. But understanding the nuances of where those trends are more dominant, what's driving a child from one place in Honduras versus a child from a place in Guatemala would be helpful, because then the response can be directly responding, sorry, my language, the responses can be directed to the actual needs on the ground. And all of the countries of origin could use help with these types of programs. And then programs for children in those countries that provide education, job skill training, the kinds of programs that will help them stay safely in their countries of origin if their migration is prompted mainly by economic reasons. And then next slide. And then back here in the States, for funders who are focused on communications and or policy work, advocacy work, there are many of the groups that provide direct services, whether it's the shelter care or legal services, track those cases very carefully to understand what the trends and challenges are. And that type of practice informs the policy recommendations that many of them make. So groups like KIND, for example, which provides legal representation to the children, looks very carefully at the trends they see, and then when they go to Congress to explain what the challenges are, or to the executive branch agencies, they're drawing from the actual experience of representation and making recommendations for changes to policy, practice, and law. And then many groups are also focusing on communications, trying to develop ways of talking about these issues that highlight the humanitarian factors involved that drive the migration, and to find ways to communicate that so that the public, the media, and policymakers understand that this is in fact a humanitarian situation and not simply a mass of young people coming to the U.S. trying to take advantage of an immigration system. So that is a very broad sweep of opportunities. As I mentioned, the document that GCIR put together in June and updated in mid-August has much more detail and suggestions for funders. If people want even more detail or would like to talk about specific groups working in specific areas, those are conversations I think that GCIR, myself, Aria, and others would be more than happy to have offline. And why don't I stop there and see if there are questions or how you'd like to proceed.
Tara, thank you very much for that overview. That was extremely useful, and I think gives all of us kind of a more clear idea of just the different engagement points that we can have. So at this point, I think what we'll do is turn to the question and answer, and we've definitely had a number of questions popping up over the course of the conversation. So Darity and Aria, I think I'd start with this question that maybe the two of you can tackle first, is what's the likelihood that any of these children, whether accompanied or unaccompanied, will actually be able to stay in the United States? And we've definitely heard that from a number of people here at the Council, and I know many of you, as you know, in your work, have also been coming up against that question.
Great. Thank you very much, Will. This is Aria. I'm going to attempt to tackle that question. It's an excellent question. So first, I'm going to talk very briefly about the accompanied children. So just to clarify, accompanied children should be accompanied only by a parent or legal guardian. If it's not a parent or legal guardian, they should be treated as unaccompanied. So this is something that advocates are tracking. We're also looking at tracking the numbers of women and children who are actually being released. There had been quite a bit of discussion within Homeland Security about reducing those numbers so that women and children were actually being transferred to the ICE detention centers in Artesia, that was mentioned by Tara, and in Kansas City. And in those two facilities, just last week, a lawsuit was filed in Artesia for due process violations, that women were not getting access to attorneys, to advice, to be able to proceed with their claims. And so I think that that is very precarious. So surely that compromises their ability to stay in the U.S. if they don't have access to a fair procedure. And then for the women and children who have been released to community, then it falls upon the existing legal service providers to try to respond to the numbers that are arriving. And I think, as we had mentioned, those are very strained, the legal resources. And so, you know, if they're unable to get legal assistance, it's very hard to make the claim once they're released into community. So I think that we can really respond to that by increasing access to legal services for accompanied children and for women. And with respect to unaccompanied children, it's quite similar in the sense that when unaccompanied children are released to caregivers in their communities, there are no appointed attorneys for them. And so they need lawyers. They should be able to stay because the numbers indicate somewhere between 60 to 70% of them would be eligible for humanitarian relief, in which case they would be able to stay lawfully in the United States. But if they don't have lawyers, they can't get access to that relief. And so, you know, it's a great question, and it goes to really hitting on that need for access to legal counsel. That's really critical for both populations.
And this is Darity. The only thing I would add to what Aria has explained is that, you know, one study was done about the importance of legal services, and I believe 90% of children who did not have representation ended up being deported, and about half who do have legal representation are able to make their case, and that reflects sort of the numbers that Aria talked about in terms of children who are actually eligible to stay in the U.S. under various protections.
Okay. Thank you, Aria and Darity. And I think, you know, that's a great segue into a couple of other questions that people have raised that I think, you know, any of our speakers, if you feel that you could potentially offer some insight, but I'll kind of combine a couple of them. And the question really is sort of around, you know, what could be the best way to support legal services through pooled funding resources or working with a local group that already provides this service, or even with the court system. And then I think additionally, even, you know, beyond the question of how you could, you know, fund or support legal services, are there any types of resources for funders to access where they can easily identify local service providers that are either providing those legal services or other types of services so that, funders can more easily and quickly connect with the service providers themselves.
This is Tara. I'd be happy to try to address that and have others chime in.
Great. Thank you, Tara.
Okay. I think that the California Endowment should correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that part of the funding that they hope to raise with Univision will be directed toward legal service, and so I will mention that and move on and see if they'd like to fill in the blanks. I think other opportunities that should be readily available to funders are state and local bar associations tend to fund legal aid in their areas, and so that can be a quick way to find out if any bar associations are in fact funding in this area. So for example, the Chicago Bar Foundation funds immigrant legal aid, and including in that some of the unaccompanied immigrant child representation in our area in Chicago. The Texas Access to Justice Foundation funds a great deal of excellent work in the state of Texas, and so there may be other resources like that, and I don't want to make work for GCIR, but maybe this is something I could volunteer to work on with GCIR to see if we could come up with a list of local foundations that are in fact focused on immigrant legal aid and unaccompanied minor immigrant aid. Another idea, and I think that we could probably obtain these lists and post them or link to them on GCIR's resource page, is the Department of Justice Executive Office for Immigration Review, which is the federal agency that runs the immigration courts. It puts out lists of legal aid providers who will take the cases for unaccompanied immigrant children and asylum seekers and others. And so for those who want to simply find a local service provider, that list might be a good place for funders to look and then contact the local provider to see if they are in need of support. I'll stop there and let others jump in.
This is Tony Vanegas with the Arizona Community Foundation. Being the largest funder here in the state, we already know and have existing relationship with those providers. And I know our colleagues to the other foundations support those providers, so we know who they are and, again, have an existing relationship already, so that should not be hard to do for us.
Hi, this is Beatriz Solis with the California Endowment, and thank you, Tara, for your points. I would say the other thing that's happening, at least what we're seeing on the ground, is that many funders really appreciated coordinating funding so that it's really focused on the areas of need. And through GCIR's assistance, we've been able to sort of drill down quite a bit in terms of, sometimes these nonprofit or organizations that provide legal services like Carecen or Chirla, they need a coordinator because they may have sufficient lawyers available to them, but they need a coordinator or they need an interpreter, a qualified interpreter. So I think GCIR has been really helpful in sort of drilling down in terms of where the need is. So again, I would highly recommend, that capacity building that they have to help think that through. And then secondly, in California, just a day ago, the governor approved $3 million for legal services. So we are reaching out to both assembly members that have approved it and the governor to see how we can better coordinate those dollars with sort of existing philanthropic dollars and kind of building upon the knowledge that we have today, how best to deploy those funds and so that it's more synergistic and impactful. So I think there's a coordination piece that at least that I'm seeing that's coming up a lot. And I know, I agree, Tara, it's like a lot to put on GCIR, but I think there's a lot of lessons learned from different states. And that would be really helpful to see how different states are actually addressing the issue, because there may be best practices that are like quickly emerging from other states that maybe others want to adopt. And then lastly, we do have some individual donors that are sort of stepping up to the plate and wanting to know how to engage. And so having sort of this broader tent has really helped sort of move the needle a little bit here in California.
This is Darren. In response to that same question about legal services and, how best to fund, we do have, through the process for the Univision campaign, a listing of organizations that work in the top 10 states. So if folks are interested, just please get in touch with us at GCIR, because we do have access to that information. And as you gathered from Aria's presentation and remarks from the other presenters, this area of law is very specialized. So it's not like going to your, regular legal service provider can't necessarily take on a case like this. So, definitely, if you're interested, let us know.
Terrific. Thank you, Darren. So we've got a few minutes left. I think I can raise at least one or two more questions from the list. One came in specifically for you, Bruce. I think asking if you would be able to elaborate a little bit more on what the Meadows Foundation proposal looks like, and more specifically, what issues you're hoping to support as you work across the state of Texas. Bruce, did we lose you? Well, we may have lost Bruce. I know schedules may have been a little bit of a conflict towards the end of the call. Bruce, there you are, Bruce. Okay,
yeah.
Terrific.
Yeah, sorry. Anyway, I repeat myself. The proposals are from the organizations. We've got about 6 proposals in hand. As I indicated earlier, 2 are from border groups on the border providing that humanitarian assistance to women with the accompanied children group. 2 or 3 are with organizations that provide that specialized immigration representation service, either directly and or through training of pro bono lawyers. And I agree with the comments made earlier. This is a very specialized area of law. Third is working. We've let the word get out to a lot of the ORR facilities that we would be interested in hearing if they have needs that are not being met by their federal under their federal contracts, and or if they are having to borrow from Peter to pay Paul to manage the increase of the children, perhaps before federal reimbursement is made, or they've diverted resources from their other core programs to deal with the spike in the numbers. And then lastly, and least organized, is some efforts, one group that wants to step forward in Dallas and serve as sort of the case manager for the new arrivees coming into the Dallas area, working with a coalition of on-the-ground service providers, everybody from the local school district to the mental health providers, Health and Human Services, etc. As I indicated earlier, from everything we can tell, there's nobody that really has that responsibility other than as these families sort of show up within the community. Does that answer the question? About $1.5 million right now. We're looking at the proposals cumulatively amount to $1.5 million and may climb.
Terrific. Thank you, Bruce. No, I think that was definitely helpful clarification about some of the proposals that have been submitted to the Meadows Foundation, sort of how that work could potentially be focused. So I think with that, we are wrapping up with the hour and a half of time that we have for today's webinar. So I think first and foremost would just again really like to thank all of our speakers and the organizations that they represent. I mean, all of you are doing tremendous work, and I think the expertise that you bring to this issue is extremely critical, and the council is just very fortunate to we are glad to have the opportunity to work with all of you and continue to help build awareness about this issue and how funders can be engaged. I think again, this webinar has been recorded, and the slides as well will also all be available through not only the council website, but we'll be sharing that with GCIR and the other organizations that were here today. But please do not feel or hesitate, I should say, to reach out to any of us, because as the situation and I think crisis continues to evolve, the landscape of how we can all get engaged and help will continue to evolve as well. I think with that then, I just again would like to extend a special thanks to all of you that participated today, and definitely took an hour and a half of your time to learn more. And please continue all of the great work that all of you do throughout not just the country, but I think globally. And with that, I think we will conclude the webinar, and have a great day, everyone.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.